The good old days, Suzan W.
Thank you so much, Doug, and welcome our guests. It's good to see the members here. Have you ever had the thought in your mind, I wish I could live in those good old days when life was slower, simpler, and you had time to talk to your friends? Well, I'm here to tell you that the good old days were not that good. And there is a term in our nation for those good old days, and those days were after the Civil War until the early 1900s. And so tonight I'm going to give you a realistic look to this idealized picture of the good old days. Because when I get through, I want you to think that whenever you feel sorry for yourself, after you've heard this, you will never feel sorry for yourself. And I'm going to talk about the 1800s in New York City. I'm going to talk about life for over 100,000 children during those days. And I'm also going to talk about my life in the early 1940s. Because I did receive some of those old ways from my ancestors. New York City in the 1880s was a rags to riches place. You had the mansions, and then you had the slums, or the tenement houses. And I learned what tenement really means. It just means a big building with no plumbing, and big families living in one room or maybe two rooms. And there's no air conditioning, there's no heat, they're terrible places to live. And next to Fifth Avenue, from 42nd until 110th Street, you had slums, lots of slums. There were no decent accommodations. You had one of two, your choice. But then the wealthy from the mansions decided some of them had to move out. They couldn't live there forever, so they built some brownstone houses. And they looked beautiful on the outside, but they were a terrible place to live also, because they had to keep their windows closed. Because New York City in that time had lots of smells. Lots of animal smells out there, maybe pigs and horses. You could smell what they used to do. It was stuffy, and those places were difficult to maintain, and they were injurious to your health. The city was polluted. You couldn't breathe the air. There was soot, there were factory vapors, and it was the sewer gases inside were bad because they didn't have good sewer system. They used to let the pigs out in the street. Anyway, we won't talk about that. There was dampness and there was odors, and they heated their rooms with coal, those brownstones, coal stoves, and that took oxygen out of the air. So it was a terrible place. But there was an option. Steam heat was coming into vogue, as was the early radiators. But the steam heat cost $2,000 to $4,000 every 6 months. And the radiators were a novelty, and they were a nuisance because of the hammering and the hissing. So what was going to happen? Apartment living needed to happen. But there were no apartments. But one day, a man named Richard Hunt designed a prototype for apartments. And he made these apartments for the wealthy. But what he did, so that the wealthy would accept living in an apartment, he made sure the rent was high. So they rented for 7 months. It cost them $3,000 to rent those. And that was a lot of money in those days. So it was communal living by the wealthy, and it was accepted. Then the real estate entrepreneurs started building apartments for the middle class people, because the middle class started in. But you know what? They did not make those apartments very good for those middle class people. People were shelved on layers, and then they had to share floors. They were subdivided into several apartments. There was no insulation. You could smell all the cooking that went on. You could hear babies screaming. It was not a quiet place to live. The garbage removal was the animals in the street, and there was wretched overcrowding. It was terrible. But you know what happened? Because of this, lots of apartments close together, there were fires, and 4 of our American cities burned down. You had Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, and San Francisco because of shabby construction and flammable materials. Terrible place to live. Then you had another problem in New York City. You had slum children. Slum children, there were 100,000 of them that had no place to go. They lived on the streets, in boxes. But you know, this was a time of immigration, so that's why there were so many children out on the streets. The story was told, this little girl who was wandering in the street naked. She'd been beaten and she was bloody, and she had no place to go, and a social worker came by and found her, and she got, the only organization that would accept her was the cruelty to animals organization, so there she had a place to go. Now California is not like New York City, but at that time, you know, I told you immigrants were coming. Well, that's when my family came too. So my grandfather came with his family, which included my father, and they came to California. But where were they going to live? From San Francisco to San Jose, there wasn't much. It was like fields, you know, it was really nice. But so they decided they'd build a house. So what they built was, we call it the big brick house in Burlingame. And you can see that my father's picture's in there with the horse and buggy. And down here, he was building it just before the earthquake of 1906, and you can see a crack here. So he had to start all over again and make it earthquake-proof. But you can also see in this picture that they built a carriage house for the carriage and the horses and all that. And I'm going over time, so I'm going to... Well, here's the picture. This is my husband's. I did show it to you. So anyway, so we lived in the big brick house, but what was interesting about, we worked hard. There were 4 fireplaces and 1 kitchen stove for wood, and that's how we heated the house. And as I was growing up, what I experienced, I lived in that house, so it was hard work, chopping wood every day and heating the house. So I have gone through this very fast. It was a terrible time, but I want you to know, when anyone says to me that they feel sorry for themselves, I do not have any sympathy for them, because I understand the history of this country a little bit, and all they have to do is hit a little switch and the heat goes on. They don't have to work hard like they did years ago, or have gardens, and they go to the store and buy their food. So I want you, the next time you start to feel sorry for yourself, just feel happy that you live here in this area in 2017.